So today we're going to talk about the adversarial collaboration that Jeff mentioned, and some other work that is kind of in the same vein as that work. And as Jeff also mentioned, all of the work that I'll talk about today is really revolving around the relationship between consciousness and phenomenology and metacognition, and how I think that we can get a handle on one of those things by studying one of the other things, and so on and so forth. Yeah, I also have some good news to share, which is that on Friday I received tenure, and so that's pretty great. And so I hope that I'll be sticking around here for a little while longer and get to continue some of this work. So I like to start some talks like this, especially with a crowd like this, by asking kind of a rhetorical question, to which we all know there are many different types of answers. Some people will say that the reason that we have brains is so we can move around, and if we don't need to move around, we don't need to have brains. That we have reasons for brains include language and social cognition and so on. But the motivating answer for me to this question is that our brains help keep us alive. And they do so by discovering statistical regularities in our environments and internalizing those statistical regularities, creating generative models of those statistical regularities, operating on those models in order to drive adaptive and goal-directed behavior. And so this is really like, from an evolutionary perspective, the reason to have a brain at all is so you don't die. And one of the kind of specifically interesting characteristics of this process for me is that as we monitor and internalize and build models of those statistical regularities in our environments and operate on them to stay alive, we do so while we also are monitoring our ability to do so. We're monitoring our ability to extract those statistical regularities. We're producing confidence judgments in those internal models, and those confidence judgments can serve as surprise markers for when we thought we got the model right and we really, really didn't. And we need to update our internal model in order to continue to behave adaptively and to continue to survive. And so this is what I just said, is that we use this uncertainty monitoring to update our internal models of the environment. And it seems like these capacities, and some of the arguments I'll make today, are also related to the phenomenological experience of doing so. In self-monitoring, we are aware of ourselves. There is something that it is like to engage in a lot of these processes. Maybe not all metacognitive or uncertainty monitoring processes are conscious, but there is something that it is like to feel sure that we have made a correct perceptual decision, and something that it is like to feel like we need to gather more information in order to come up with a solid or a reliable, precise internal model of the world. And so one of the then motivating questions of my research program is, how in the world does consciousness phenomenology occur, with specific focus on the phenomenology of confidence judgments, of feeling sure about your perceptual decisions? But as we'll get to, we'll hopefully come full circle by the end of the talk, we will hopefully see that the study of the phenomenological experience of confidence or of uncertainty might give us a narrow but tractable path towards studying phenomenology on a broader scale. And as promised, one of the big projects that we're undertaking right now is an adversarial collaboration to try to unravel and arbitrate different theories of how it is that we become phenomenally aware of our worlds, and what the relationship might be between that ability and our brains and our neural implementation of those capacities. So, of course, we all know that solving this problem is really hard. It's so hard that it's been called one of the hard problems. And there are so many theories out there, some of which are more computational and neuroscientific, some of which are more on the philosophical side. But nevertheless, there are so many theories out there, so many of which purport to have solid empirical evidence to support them, that there is this, initiative from the Templeton World Charity Foundation that they call the Adversarial Collaborations Project, where the idea is that this is kind of the thunderdome of scientific theory arbitration, where two theories will enter and then they will fight it out and one theory will ultimately leave. And so some of these theories are currently being tested with these adversarial collaborations. They're one of the first, or the first adversarial collaboration pits global workspace theory against integrated information theory. And the one that we are working on right now is pitting local recurrency or first order theories, championed by Victor Lema and Johannes Fahrenfort and others, against higher order theories championed by both philosophers and cognitive neuroscientists, David Rosenthal, Hakwon Lau, Richard Brown, Joe Ledoux, Axel Clearmans, and others. I should have put Steve Fleming's name on there as well. And so I wanted to introduce today's talk and start us thinking about how we might arbitrate these two theories by talking about our adversarial collaboration project. So everything that I'm going to talk about for this project is part of a very large collaboration. Actually, this is only like half of the team here because the project actually includes an entire other branch that includes BU and Jan. Then there's the theory-led branch from Ned and Dave. Our theory leaders, Richard, Victor, and Hakwon, are all part of both branches, but our branch, which we are calling Experiment 1, this is Experiment 2, is co-led by myself and by Rachel Dennison at Boston University. And then there are a large number of people who have been helping out with this project, including Brian, Karen, and Michael, and then a giant pile of people who are really helping with data collection and analysis and really making the whole machine go. So I wanted to highlight them and say how grateful I am to them for their participation and engagement in what I think is a very exciting project. So our project is titled an adversarial collaboration to test predictions of first order and higher order theories of consciousness. And I'll also give thanks to the Templeton World Charity Foundation for funding this project. Okay, so to get us all on the same page, I thought I would start by telling you what exactly these theories are and why they seem to be incompatible, introduce you to a little bit of the background literature that drove the creation of these experiments. Then I'll get into showing you a little teaser of some of our results so far. And spoiler alert, it does seem to be working. There do seem to be kind of strong results going in what we thought was one direction, although, of course, the bigger picture story and interpretation of those is going to take a lot longer. Okay, local recurrency theories, or first order theories, more broadly speaking, are defined kind of like this. So a first order representation is defined as a pattern of neural responses, or typically in sensory brain regions, that normally encode an internal representation of some property of the outside world. So this is what makes them first order, is that they are about the world that is out there. They are not about some internal state of the system. So an example is a person listening to a tuning fork. They might have a pattern of neural responses in auditory cortex that's elicited by a particular sound that has a particular frequency. So first order theories, like the local recurrency theories championed by Victor and Johannes, make the assertion that a first order representation in a person's brain is sufficient, not just necessary, but is sufficient for the person to be phenomenally conscious of the represented property. You don't need anything extra on top of the first order representation in order to explain the fact that the person becomes phenomenally aware, that there is something that it is like from a qualitative standpoint for the person to experience that thing that's out there in the world, and that experience has phenomenal character. So going to this example again, a signal in the auditory cortex that appropriately encodes this sound of the tuning fork that is out there in the world, that is sufficient for the person to be phenomenally conscious of that sound. Higher order theories, in contrast, say that's not enough. It might be necessary, or it might be part of the processing chain, but it is not sufficient. So first order representations represent those states of the environment that are out there in the world. In contrast, a higher order representation represents a mental state. So first order representations are about the world. Higher order representations are about first order representations, or multiple levels up the food chain. You could have a higher order representation of a higher order representation, for example. But the distinguishing component is what they are about. So The higher order theories, in contrast to the first order theories, state that higher order representations about first order representations are necessary for perceptual phenomenal consciousness. You can't just have the first order, you need to also have the higher order. You need to be, for example, in David Rosenthal's theory, you need to be having the thought that you are in that mental state. So the mental state of the tuning fork alone is not enough. You need to also be having the thought that you are in or having the representation of the tuning fork that is out there in the world. Okay, so hopefully that distinction is clear, and hopefully these are sort of familiar to some of the audience here. So the reason that these two theories seem to be in contrast with each other, and why it has been very difficult to arbitrate them, is that you have to go fishing around and find first order representations, and you need to then maybe clamp those first order representations. You need to hold them fixed and see if you can push around on phenomenology. That's the kind of broad, high-level overview goal of the type of work that we are doing, which is if I can clamp those first order representations and show that they do not change, and yet I can change your phenomenal experience, then maybe first order theories are wrong, that the first order representation is not enough. Now that sounds all very nice from like a hand wavy, like ideal scientist point of view here, but good luck actually figuring out how to clamp those first order representations. So this is what we're trying to do in a very small, very narrow, very focused kind of way. And then we're going to see whether we can actually push around on phenomenology, despite the fact that the measured aspects of the first order representation will not change. And we think that we have a pretty reasonable shot of doing this, at the very least, based on previous studies. So just a very quick tour through the background. This is one of the I'm going to show you just a couple studies here. We're not going to do a massive overview of the literature, but the idea here is that subjective inflation, especially in the visual periphery, has been a favorite pillar of the higher order theories, to say, okay, that's great. If I can do something where I can make you more aware than you should be, or more confident than you should be based on your first order representational content, then I can demonstrate that first order representations aren't enough to explain the subjective experience of seeing. Okay, so what this means is that we can take an observation that our visual field is not uniform in its capacity to resolve the statistically rich information in our environments. So in the center of our visual peripheries, center of our visual fields, we are typically more precise in our perceptual judgments. We have lower noise relative to the magnitude of the signal, and the opposite is true in the visual periphery, that we have low spatial acuity, higher noise, and typically lower confidence. So the idea here is that typically your confidence co-varies with your capacity to do some task. The better you are at the task, the higher confidence you should feel. And so we would expect this to be mostly true, that when we ask you to do tasks in the visual periphery, you're going to be worse at them, and you're going to feel like you're worse at them. So the subjective experience goes with the first order, the readout that we have of the first order representation, which is your capacity to do the task. So the problem with this assertion is that it is not always empirically true. There are cases that we have revealed from experiments in the lab where we feel like we can see more than we actually physically can in the visual periphery. And this example is not only true in the lab, but is also true in the real world, especially under cases of not really paying attention to what's out here in your peripheral visual field. So an example of this is this nice set of photographs from Lau and Rosenthal back in 2011, where they put forth the idea that peripheral inflation, the subjective feeling that you can see more than you actually can in the visual periphery, is a pretty reasonable piece of evidence against first order theories, that there's something else going on over and above the representation of the thing that's out there in the world that has to explain the strength of your subjective experience. So those of us who are vision scientists in the room, we know that the visual periphery is not only noisy and has lower spatial acuity due to the distribution of photoreceptors, but there's also not a whole lot of cones out there. There's really only rods. There's a few cones scattered around. And so it is physiologically impossible for you to see high fidelity color in the visual periphery. And yet, when I ask you to stare at the screen in front of you right now, but kind of like, pay attention to your visual periphery, it doesn't look like this thing on the left. It looks more like the thing on the right. The reality is probably a little halfway in between, but we know that physiologically, the information that is coming from out here in your visual periphery is basically black and white. It is not seeing in color, and yet you don't experience that. You experience seeing in color and in high fidelity. So the argument has been made then that peripheral inflation, especially under cases of not really paying attention to your visual periphery, this gives us a great opportunity to study the performance and the subjective sense of that performance that phenomenology may dissociate. And this could inform the first order versus higher order theory debate, because this phenomenon and lab-based variations on it have been used as a favorite pillar of these higher order theories. Say first order doesn't have enough going on, that there needs to be something more in order to explain phenomenology. Okay, so here's some of the lab-based experiments that have been done to show that this isn't just kind of an anecdotal observation that I can just wave my hands at you and then we'll move on and take that as truth. So this is a set of studies that was done by Dobi Ranev and colleagues back in 2011. And the idea is that they show these Gabor patches out here in the visual periphery, and they're embedded in some sort of noise, and your goal is to pay attention to one set of patches, and then you are cued to respond about the orientation, the signal presence or absence, or the overall orientation, left or right tilt of the Gabor patches at the end of their display period. And sometimes the cues are invalid. Most of the time you are cued to respond to the region where you will ultimately actually have to respond. And then sometimes these cues are invalid and they surprise you and say, just kidding, we're going to actually ask you to pay attention and respond to the other ones after the fact. And what they found, this is kind of I'm skipping ahead here to show you the critical finding, which is that they could manipulate the signal to noise ratio and the overall signal contrast of these peripherally presented stimuli. So these are out here kind of in the visual periphery. They could manipulate the signal to noise ratio such that when you are cued, the cue is valid, or when you are uncued, the cue is invalid. Your D prime, your capacity to actually do this objective task, to report the content of the first order representation, is matched. You're just as good when we cue you to respond, when we ask you to respond to the cued targets, as when we ask you to respond to the uncued targets. And yet, there was this massive difference in reported sense of visibility. How well did you think you saw the target? In that, despite on some level, holding the first order representation constant, at least by this metric here, which is one of the, we don't have the ability to go and measure every neuron just yet, but by this metric, the signal to noise ratio of the internal first order representation was held constant. And yet this visibility judgment was massively different between the two conditions. And so this was some evidence that performance, so a readout of the first order representation, presence, dynamics, fidelity, and so on, and a readout of the higher order representation, which might control your subjective sense of visibility, that these are different things. And so it can't just all be done by the first order content. A follow-up study was done by Lee et al. In 2018. So here they're using much more naturalistic stimuli. This is a simulated driving experiment where you're driving along this little road and like you get this little cue that says pay attention to the right, and then like these little guys show up here and they're wearing little colored shirts, and then at some point after the offset of these little targets, you get a question that says, was the shirt of the guy on the left yellow, and what is your confidence? Or was the shirt on the guy on the right yellow, and what is your confidence? And so once again, you can imagine that they've got like these valid cues where you're cued to pay attention on the right, and then you actually have to respond on the right. Or like in this diagram here, you're cued to pay attention on the right, and then you're actually asked to respond on the left. And then there's also a baseline condition with no attentional cueing. And due to, again, the same types of manipulations, they were able to show that D prime, or in this case, the unequal variance version of D prime, D prime or DA, was shown to be not significantly different across these three conditions, and yet there was a significant difference in the criterion, like the kind of confidence criterion that was shown here. So you'll notice I'm switching a little bit back between visibility and confidence, and I'll get back to that later in the talk about the actual conceptual relationship between the two. But nevertheless, these two experiments and a number of others that have been done demonstrate, or at least have been argued to demonstrate, that there is something beyond the first order representation, which assumedly is read out by these objective performance metrics. There's something more than that going on when we're trying to explain the subjective experience of seeing. So the argument has been made then that subjective inflation in the visual periphery, especially under inattention, supports the idea that objective performance and subjective awareness can be caused to dissociate. And so then, of course, we get questions about what could the mechanisms be. And in this adversarial collaboration, can we use this to push on local recurrency theories or higher order theories to see whether one of them starts to break down? Can we actually measure this not only behaviorally, but eventually neurally, to see whether there is something going on in the first order representation, presumably in sensory areas, that could explain why this is happening over and above, why this is happening even from a first order local recurrency perspective. If we can't do that, then it seems like the local recurrency first order theories might have a little bit of a problem. So this adversarial collaboration is trying to find this out. It's trying to specifically ask, what is the relationship between first order signals and subjective perceptual strength? So the first order theory will say that subjective perceptual strength is not dissociable from first order local recurrency signal strength, because first order signals are necessary and sufficient to determine the phenomenology. And higher order theory, of course, says, nope, not sufficient, you need something else. So in this set of experiments, we're going to look for subjective peripheral inflation under inattention, but we're going to do it in like 6 different ways, with the idea that we're going to find the biggest possible effect size. And then we're going to put that particular behavioral paradigm in the MRI scanner. We're going to measure the first order local recurrency strength, and we're going to see whether it actually goes with the subjective strength, or whether there is some way that the subjective experience can be explained by the first order local recurrency magnitude or dynamics or so on. If we cannot find that, it's going to be a tough day for the recurrent processing theory folks. Okay, so we are currently in phase 1. Here is the general overview of the design that we're using. So we show you a fixation cross, we show you some little cues that are black and they don't do anything for a little bit. And then we show you a valid cue or a neutral cue or an invalid cue. These turn off. We show you 4 test stimuli. These are figure ground stimuli. So they're made up by a bunch of like randomly oriented lines here. And then here we have a bunch of coherently oriented lines, and a figure is defined by a bunch of coherently oriented lines that are orthogonal. So the subjective experience of this, if you're just looking at it right now, is that you should see an oval right here. It doesn't have a physical contour in that I haven't drawn a line around it, but you get this sense that there is an oval kind of floating there on a hash marked background. And we can vary the length of these lines such that this oval pops out more or less. And then we're asking people to, based on the location cued by this response cue, which again could be valid, invalid, or neutral with regard to the pre-stimulus cues, we're asking them to say, did you see the thing? And what orientation was this oval? Was it vertical or was it horizontal? So we're getting a measure of objective performance capacity, which we assume is related to the first order representation, fidelity, stability, signal to noise ratio, and so on. And then we were also getting a subjective experience rating. So I didn't see anything at all, like I had no visual experience of an oval. I saw that a thing was there, that it kind of popped out from the background, but I'm not sure whether it was vertical or horizontal. So I'm guessing whether it was oriented one way or the other. And I will say anecdotally and from personal experience during the piloting phase of this actually happened more often than I thought it would happen, that I had this experience of like, I definitely saw a thing there, but I don't know whether it was vertical or horizontal. And then there's also like, I saw a figure and I clearly saw whether it was vertical or horizontal. Okay. And so we do some other kind of fancy stuff to make sure that we're thresholding, where half of the time we're cueing you to respond to a target that is not physically there. So this is like a detection task as well. And so hopefully, though, the task is fairly clear. And we have then, via this line length manipulation, the capacity to change the visibility and the objective performance capacity for observers to tell whether this is vertical or horizontal. So we have cases where there is no figure present. We have a reference strength that is thresholded. And then we have like line lengths that are shorter and shorter so that it becomes harder and harder for this thing to pop out of the screen. And then we have line lengths that are longer and longer. And so you'll notice from this that we actually have a lot of different kind of difficulty conditions and a lot of different subjective strength types of conditions. And the goal of this is, if you recall from the previous studies here, like, for example, they had 2 levels, cued and uncued, and they titrated some stuff to find like a threshold here, or like they had several different levels of contrast and they had these visibility ratings and so on. But and this one, again, like they kind of had 1 or 2 conditions, maybe that they're kind of titrating, and then they're changing the cueing, but they've also like thresholded each of these separately. Our goal with this set of studies here is to build like an entire psychometric function at both the type 1 objective performance level and type 2 subjective experience level. And so that kind of looks like this. Oh, sorry, let me just tell you a little bit about this here. What's the correct answer? It's not vertical nor horizontal, it's diagonal. This is diagonal to you? It's not oriented like this? All right. We can come back to that a little bit later, but yeah, we can. I promise you, it is actually vertical or horizontal. The lines are diagonal, but the oval itself is vertical or horizontally oriented. Sorry if that wasn't clear. Okay, so the whole thing is pre-registered on OSF. We have simultaneous replication. This is very open science, very transparent. So we have 2 sites here at UC Irvine and Rachel's lab at Boston University. We're collecting. This doesn't look like a lot of subjects, but I promise you, when each of them is coming in for 6 hours, this is actually a lot of data. So we have 15 subjects per site, so 30 people total. Each person has 6 hours of data, or 360 trials total. So we've got 1,000 hours of data just for this one study, and this is one of 6 experiments that we're going to do. For those of you who might be salivating over this data set, yes, it will be shared. And the code for reproducing it in your own lab also will be shared. So you can pull it down and you can dig through what we're doing. Okay, so the analysis plan looks like this. And I just realized I missed another question before about inflation, but maybe we can go to that at the end. Sorry about that. Okay, so the analysis is going to look like this. We're going to do kind of our standard psychometric function stuff, where we're going to have stimulus strength on the x-axis and probability of correct orientation of the oval, vertical or horizontal, on the y-axis. And we're going to hope that when you pay attention to stuff, you're better at telling whether it is vertical or horizontal. And we confirmed that this was the case in pilot studies, so we know we're kind of in the right range of this stimulus strength, which is that line length manipulation. But then we have some additional analyses that are going to be critical to identifying whether there is peripheral subjective inflation. So we're going to plot now probability of choosing high visibility, probability of saying, like, I really clearly saw the thing, against stimulus strength. And we're going to assume that this also probably follows this same type of relationship here, where when you pay more attention, you're probably more likely to rate high visibility, and that this is probably also tied to the fact that not only is it just changing the subjective visibility, it's actually changing the underlying signal-to-noise ratio. So we would expect to see something like this. We would expect to see that as you get better at the task, you also rate higher visibility. This is not surprising. And if attention boosts your ability to do the task, it's also going to boost the visibility. But now here comes the critical analysis, okay? So once again, remember, we're trying to kind of hold the first order representation constant somehow, rather than externally clamping it or manipulating it with thresholding so that we're changing around the stimulus to find like where we just so happen to not get a D prime difference because we failed to reject the null hypothesis. Now we're going to do away with that and just measure the entire what we're calling a type 2 or metaperceptual psychometric function. So now we're putting the y-axis from this graph on the x-axis here, and the y-axis from this graph on the y-axis, and we're going to plot performance capacity against awareness. If it is the case that what attention is doing is it's boosting the signal-to-noise ratio in the first-order representation, we would expect this plot to look exactly like this. If that is all you need to explain the subjective experience of doing the task, we would expect that if attention makes you a little bit better at the task, it's going to make you feel like you're doing a little bit better at the task, or like you feel like you can see it a little bit better, exactly the right amount to account for the increase in performance. Okay, so this would be a no subjective inflation result. This is what it would look like if you had what we're calling performance relative subjective inflation. So this is cases where under inattention, which has been empirically shown to be a viable path forward in the past by other groups, under inattention, your probability of saying, I clearly saw the thing, should be higher than under paying attention to the visual periphery for the same exact level of probability of being correct, the same exact signal to noise ratio in the underlying first order representation as read out by this. That is the logic here, at least. And so you can kind of imagine drawing a vertical line here and saying that for exactly the same signal to noise ratio in the underlying first order representation, if this is reading that out, you would be more likely to say you saw the thing when you're not paying attention than when you are paying attention. Okay, what do you guys think is going to happen? We found performance relative subjective inflation. And this is very significant. I know you're not supposed to say that in statistics, but it absolutely is. So the idea here that's being plotted in this bar graph is that we're taking the area under each of these curves. So instead of just drawing a single vertical line and measuring where the curve is at that single vertical line, we're taking the entire area under each of these curves and seeing which one is biggest. There's some nuances to the analysis that we can get into if you want. But if we do the omnibus ANOVA, there's no site-specific effects or interactions, and we have a very clear effect of attention on this measure of performance relative subjective inflation. So this first step seems like it's actually a challenge to first order theories, in that when inattention reduces your performance capacity, or when attention increases your performance capacity, it doesn't move around your subjective experience necessarily in the same direction or in the same amount. And that's really a problem for these first order theories, because as they published in our pre-registration, so I want you to pay attention to this bottom thing here. Don't worry about the absolute subjective inflation. We're not talking about that right now. They signed off on the fact that if we find performance relative subjective inflation, they are challenged. This is like a published pre-registration thing, not peer-reviewed published, but it is up in the world. It is public. And so our initial results here suggest that first order theories might have a little bit of a problem. Now I'll give you a sneak preview just in words of where we're going next, which is that this is the experiment I just showed you. We found performance relative subjective inflation. I don't have graphs to show you for experiment 1.2, which is a discrimination experiment instead of a detection experiment. But I will tell you in words that that also worked, and the effect size is actually like way bigger than what I just showed you. So with a different cohort of subjects, different strength of stimuli, all that kind of stuff, we found basically exactly the same thing, only much bigger. We're also going to do it with Gabor patches so that we can link it to previous studies. And we're going to use a different attentional manipulation with kind of the most successful versions of this here, but using a rapid serial visual presentation central task to draw your attention to the center and pull your attention away from the visual periphery, so that hopefully we can see that that's even bigger. And I told you that we are also going to take whichever one of these works the best, and then we're going to stick it in the scanner. And that is going to be the critical analysis. Because when we put this thing in the scanner, what we're looking for is not performance relative subjective inflation. We're looking for first order recurrency relative subjective inflation. So the idea is that these figure ground stimuli, through taking the conditions where there is a stimulus actually present and subtracting off conditions where there is a stimulus that is not present. The beautiful thing about these figure ground defined stimuli is that that subtraction allows you to actually get the magnitude of the first order recurrency effect, because if there's no figure present, the feed forward sweep from all of the stimuli on the screen is supposed to be just about exactly the same as when there is a figure present. So you do the subtraction, you get the magnitude of the first order local recurrency signal. We've got some tricks to try to get at this also trial by trial. And then we can actually plot this whole thing except put the MRI signal on the x-axis. And if we find this, then the first order people might really be in trouble, at least according to the pre-registration document. So what time is it? Okay, great. So I wanted to tell you about this whole project because it's something that I'm really excited about here. It's even more exciting because we're not allowed to actually look at the data until both sites finish data collection on each one of these waves. And so there's this like nail-biting moment where we've put hundreds and hundreds of hours into data collection at each site, and then like finally the data collection is finished, we upload it to the private GitHub, and then we are allowed to press go on the analysis. And it's so no peeking. And so the fact that this is working so well and that this one is even bigger than this one in terms of its effect size is really very exciting, and also a testament to all the hard work for all the people who have been working on this project. So thank you very much to all of them. Okay, so I'm just going to very quickly then, before we wrap up, tell you just about a little bit more of the work that's going on in my lab, showing that this set of experiments and this approach to trying to understand the neural correlates and kind of computational mechanisms of subjective experience, those experiments are just part of the bigger picture. So we have some ongoing work that includes not only this adversarial collaboration, testing first order and higher order theories, but we're also trying to measure the subjective inflation effect due to other factors. So not just due to attentional manipulations, maybe also due to visual field location more generally. Is it possible to get peripheral subjective inflation and to understand why it's happening when you don't have inattention at all? And so for this set of experiments, we were looking at natural scene statistics. This is just a smattering of examples going back to the beginning of the talk where I said brains extract statistical regularities from the environment. Yeah, great. We know that they extract the fact that light typically comes from above, or that like vertical orientations and contours in the world tend to be more common than horizontal orientations, and we use this to make perceptual judgments. But the observation we made in this study was that maybe distributions of noise in like a signal to noise ratio sense in the visual center versus the visual periphery, they are different. It's noisier in the visual periphery, but also due to the fact that noise can't be negative. In the visual periphery, they're probably positively skewed distributions, a lot more than in the visual center, where it's a much more constrained distribution of possible noise that you might encounter. And so in this experiment, this set of simulations, so not really an empirical study, Jared did a bunch of simulations to say, well, what if the visual system assumed that the noise was bigger in the visual periphery, but didn't correctly assume that it was positively skewed? Would that be enough to explain visual peripheral inflation? He found that yes, that does seem to be enough. And so this paper was published now 2 years ago in Attention Perception Psychophysics. You can go and check that out if you want. And I will also highlight that Jarrett was an undergrad when he did this, and so that was pretty cool too. We've also got some cases where we're looking at the relationship between perceptual capacity and awareness or confidence all around the visual field, not just like center versus peripheral along the vertical meridian here. So we're going to do the vertical meridian, the horizontal meridian. We're going to try all sorts of different locations with the goal of actually mapping the relationship between perceptual performance capacity and awareness or confidence across the entire visual field. We know that there are performance fields that are kind of heart-shaped based on properties of the retina and so on. So if we can measure the relationship between perceptual performance capacity and awareness all across the visual field, that will place a lot more constraints onto some of the models that we're building about this relationship, which will tell us, are those models doing a good job no matter what we throw at them or not? And this was work being done by a second-year PhD student in my lab, Angela Shen. And she's going to be presenting this stuff at VSS in just a few weeks and at ASSC in June. And so maybe I'll see some of you there as well. We're also looking at this relationship just with stimulus manipulations. So in this set of experiments, we used the observation that the previous studies tend to have like more stuff on the screen leads to feeling more confident in your decision, even if some of that more stuff is noise. So in this set of experiment, we have full field random dot kinematograms that take up the entire computer monitor. And this kind of looks like TV snow blowing around in a blizzard on your screen. And we can manipulate the dot density of these random dot kinematograms such that at low density, this looks a little bit like snow flurries. And at high density, this looks like a crazy blizzard, like coming at you really intensely. And then on each trial, on one or the other side of the screen here to the left or right of fixation, some of these dots start moving coherently downward in one direction, like a little waterfall. And then you have to say which side did the dots move coherently on and give us your confidence judgments. And we did this in a block design where the snow is all of the same density for a block of trial. So lots of flurries, 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 end of block, blizzard, 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 or every single trial, it changes from flurries to blizzard and back. And what we found in this study is that the block design, this is again, performance versus now it's confidence on the y-axis, but the same kind of relationship here, that the block design did not actually produce any dissociations between performance and these kinds of measures of subjective experience, but the interleave design did. We see this nice separation between the curves along the D prime versus confidence meta-perceptual function as a function of density. And we did some stats and this came out. The reason that this has been in revision for 2 years is that we went back to the drawing board to get the analysis right. And it became a lot more complicated than we thought. But now we're finally at the final stages there. And so look out for this coming out with a toolbox in the near future. Okay, and then I'm not going to give you details about this, but most of the work that I've shown you here, with the exception of the first order local recurrency stuff, this has all been behavioral and computational. But we do have a number of ongoing projects in the lab that are looking at trying to identify a link between the computations that are going on at the simulation level, so to speak, or at the behavioral level, where we can capture and provide a computational level explanation for what's going on. We want to link that back to the brain because ultimately that's kind of the real test. There's a number of different theories that might all be consistent with the same types of kind of edge-like or weird behavior. And the only way to really arbitrate those is to go fishing around in the brain. And so we have some other work that's funded by the Air Force and by CFAR to try to understand the information flow between brain regions, where the information is coming from, where it's going to, and how the type of information that's flowing between those two regions is going to map back onto the parameters in our computational modeling approaches. So you'll notice, though, that throughout everything that I've talked about today, I've kind of switched back and forth between this metacognition measure and the awareness, the visual awareness measure. So you'll notice I kind of switched here. I was talking about confidence, and here I'm talking about confidence. But here I was talking about, peripheral inflation. And just to go back a little bit farther, here I'm talking about like subjective sense of visibility and not confidence in a judgment per se. And so I wanted to address that a little bit here with a specific focus, and this is kind of the end of what we'll talk about today here, a specific focus on why it is that I think that it's not that I am saying that visibility and confidence are identical, but that I think that metacognition gives us a very particular way of getting at the computations underlying phenomenological experiences more generally. And so while I don't encourage people to kind of mix them up and flip back and forth and say that they are the same thing, because they are absolutely not, I think that they have an intimate relationship. And so I wanted to end with some kind of theoretical considerations that I hope we can talk about in the discussion if you guys would like, which is, why are we going to study metacognition if what we really want to know about is visual phenomenology or phenomenology strength in general? And so in this paper that I published last fall, I laid out 5 properties, some of which are conceptual, some of which are practical, that I think make a compelling argument that this link is real and that it is useful for us. So the first is how I started the talk today, which is the observation that confidence possesses accompanying subjective experience or phenomenal character, that there is something that it's like to feel sure in a decision. It may not be that metacognitive evaluation is always accompanied by phenomenal experience, but there are cases where it is, and where it seems like that phenomenological experience can be decoupled from the modality about which a confidence judgment is made. So the fact that it feels like something to feel sure in a decision at least makes this a reasonable target to go after. And then we get into some more practical reasons here, which is, as we mentioned at the beginning, confidence, like other higher order representations, is about an internal representation. It offers a formal way to define and probe introspection and higher order capacities, such that it's bringing a computational and neuroscientific rigor to some of the higher order theories, which until relatively recently have been more on the philosophical side. So this allows us to sink our teeth into some empirical anchors here, which I think is really important. Confidence is also a recursive, or metacognition is also a recursive computation, meaning that we can make the assumption, Occam's razor style, that unless we have good reason to believe otherwise, confidence computations are inherited from previous processing levels, meaning that you can have confidence about confidence about confidence. So if you have a first order representation and then you have a higher order representation about that first order representation, there's nothing stopping you from doing it again, from having a third order representation about that higher order that first kind of middle higher order representation. And in fact, I don't have it up on this slide, but there was a really nice paper published the end of last year, I want to say. Taryn Balzan is the senior author, where they explicitly tested this. They tested up to like 4th order cognition and found that a single set of computations could actually explain each of those levels of hierarchical processing. So they had people do a judgment about some objective property of the stimulus, and then rate their confidence, and a judgment about some objective property of another stimulus and rate their confidence. And then they said, which of those 2 confidence judgments do you feel more confident in? And then they did the whole thing again and said, which of those two confidence judgments do you feel more confident in? And they went up to the 4th level, and they found that these Bayesian computations could actually explain the whole thing pretty well, which I thought was really cool. And so we have this kind of empirically useful or practically useful capacity then to say, if we find one of the computations, it's likely to kind of apply to multiple levels. So we're not fishing around for completely different functional forms every time we move one layer up the food chain. And then we get to the practical properties. Metacognitive processes are objectively characterizable. I was just talking about Bayesian models. We can write down math just like we would with any other psychophysical model. We can write down math to say, what should the relationship be, or what might the relationship be between properties of a first order representation and this readout of a higher order representation? I can say, I think the functional form is this, and I think that the decision policy that I apply to that higher order representation is that. I'm going to marginalize across this variable, yada, yada. And we can actually then go test that with observable behavior. Does that actually explain the relationship between confidence judgments and first order judgments about the world in a satisfactory capacity across a lot of different domains? And then this brings us to our last point, which is that confidence computations themselves are unobservable, and yet they are hierarchically dependent, which makes them a lot more complicated even than some classic psychophysics models that are admittedly very complicated, but are about the relationship between the objective property of the world and the internal representation of that objective property. Here we're talking about the relationship between the objective measurable property of the world, some internal representation, and then some other internal representation of that representation. So the whole system kind of looks like this. And as you get farther and farther up the processing hierarchy, it gets more and more hidden. Like there's a lot of moving parts here. There's a lot of ways for a model to get this wrong, to say, I'm going to specify the internal representation here about the external world, And then I'm going to specify the internal representation about this internal representation, and so on and so forth. If I get any one of these pieces right, including the relationship between the first order and the higher order representation, the whole model falls apart. And so if it doesn't fall apart, then maybe I've actually hit on something true and real about how metacognition works. It's really easy to break, which means if it doesn't break, maybe we're onto something. Okay, so those are the 5 properties of metacognition that I think really make it a really attractive target for trying to study phenomenology from a computational perspective, that allows us to take this big question of how and why we become phenomenally aware to how is it that we could best study how phenomenal awareness is generated. And these adversarial collaborations that I have, one of which I've talked about today, I think is a really great starting point, a focus on practical approaches. What are the pinch points at which these 2 theories disagree? Let's go push on those. Let's find out how far we can push these theories in making precise, falsifiable, unique, and quantitative types of predictions, so we don't end up saying, oh, more information means more consciousness, or more quantum vibrations means more consciousness. These aren't really empirically tractable. So if we change the question so that we're really homing in on those falsifiable and unique and quantitative predictions, I think metacognition is one of the handles that'll help us make good progress on these types of questions. Okay, so, and what I'm talking about here about generative explanations, I'll just put up a really nice quote from Lisa Meraki from a few years ago, talking about that generative explanations are really the ones that we're wanting to get at. We don't want to know if I fiddle around with this in the brain, it changes that experience. I want to know why and how fiddling around with this thing in the brain, or this thing at a first order or higher order representational level, changes the phenomenal experience. I'm not satisfied with if I poke on this, then something else happens over here. I want to know that generative connection, how a new natural kind can emerge from the things that I'm doing to this representation or this implementation at a neural level. Okay, so maybe I've convinced some of you here that consciousness science is pretty fun, and that I think we've got a good way of making tractable progress on it with some of the work that I've described here. So I think I will stop there and just thank all of the members of my lab, all of my collaborators. All these folks are working so hard, and I am so grateful for their effort and for their intellect. I want to thank my funding sources. I'll make a pitch again that if any of you are coming to BSS in May or ASSC in New York in June, please stop by. We've got a couple posters and talks at each one, or just come say hi and we can chat. And thanks again for your attention and for, again, accommodating me virtually. I'm very grateful and I'm very happy to be here.